Hi, welcome back. Our previous lesson was on the first part of setting prices when you have market power. Today we'll be moving on to the second part. So, in our previous lesson, we saw that firms have two analytical tools that helps them to evaluate the trade-off between selling larger quantities and charging higher prices. Now, we talked about the first two being a firm's demand curve, where we saw that firms that have lower market power have a relatively more elastic demand curve, and firms that have a higher market power have a relatively more inelastic demand curve. Today, we'll be moving on to the second two, which is the marginal revenue curve. So, the question we'll be answering here is how can a firm use its marginal revenue curve to figure out what price to charge? Now, what is marginal revenue? So, marginal revenue is simply the additional revenue from selling one more unit of any product. So, it's simply calculated as the change in total revenue from selling one more unit. So, let's consider an example of laptops. We have the prices and the quantity sold or the quantity demanded. Now we are going to use this information to calculate our total revenue and marginal revenue. So our total revenue formula is simply the price of the good times the quantity sold. So when the price of the good was 2,400, the quantity sold is 1. So the total revenue is simply 2,400. Now when the price of the good reduced to 2,300, the quantity sold increased to 2. So the total revenue is 2 times the price, which is 4,600. When the price reduced to 2,200, the total quantity sold is 3, and then the total revenue now increases to 6,600, which is simply price times 3 quantity sold. Then when the price reduced to 2,100, the quantity sold increased to 4, which increased the total revenue to 8,400. Now, to calculate the marginal revenue is simply the change in the total revenue as we sell one more unit. So when we're selling one unit, the marginal revenue is simply the total revenue, which is 2,400. When we sold one more unit, which increased the total quantity sold to 2, we have total revenue increasing from 2,400 to 4,600. So the marginal revenue is simply the total revenue from selling 2 units minus the total revenue from selling 1 unit. So the second unit sold brought in a marginal revenue of 2,200. Now, similarly, for the third unit sold, the total revenue increased from 4,600 to 6,600. So the marginal revenue is simply the new total revenue minus the old total revenue, which is 2,000. And then this is also the case for the fourth unit sold. So this additional unit increased the total revenue to 8,400. So the difference between the new total revenue and the previous one is 1,800. Now we can use this information to draw our demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. On our vertical axis, we have our price or marginal revenue. And then on our horizontal axis, we have the quantity sold or demanded of this laptop. Now let's start with our demand curve. When the price of the good was 2,100, the demand is 4. So 4 laptops were sold at that price. So if we represent this as point A, and then when price increased to 2,200, we see that quantity reduced to 3. So we represent this at point B. And similarly, for when price increased to 2,300, quantity reduced to 2, we represent this at point C. Then when price increased to 2,400, quantity reduced to 1, we represent this at point D. So if we connect these 4 points, A, B, C, and D, we have this particular firm's demand curve, which is a typical demand curve that is downward sloping, indicating that at higher prices, lower quantity is demanded and then sold. So we can also draw our marginal revenue curve with this information. So we see that when the quantity sold is 1, our marginal revenue is 2,400. So this coincides with point D. Now, when we show two quantities, marginal revenue for this additional unit is 2,200. So we have this marginal revenue corresponding with this quantity. We can represent this at point E. Now, when we increase the quantity sold to 3, the revenue that the third unit brought in was 2,000. So this is point F. And then finally, when we sold 4 units, the revenue that the fourth unit brought in is 1,800, which is point J. So if we connect D, E, F, and J, we have our marginal revenue curve. Now, let's look at some things that characterizes this marginal revenue curve. So the first thing to note is that for every marginal revenue curve, it reflects two things: the output effect and the discount effect. Now, let's bear this in mind as we do our analysis. Remember that total revenue is price times quantity. And we mentioned that firms usually trade off between higher prices and higher quantities. And a typical demand curve shows us that for firms to sell higher quantities, it means that they have to charge lower prices. The first effect that we look at here is the output effect. So the output effect is simply the price that you get from selling that additional unit. Now, what this means is an extra unit of laptop will boost your revenue by the amount equal to the price of the extra laptop sold. So that accounts for the output effect. Now, what is the discount effect? So the discount effect tells us that to sell one extra laptop, the seller will have to lower prices a bit, which will cut into the revenue. So remember that we're saying that firms usually trade off between higher prices and higher quantities. So with a typical demand curve, to sell an extra unit of a good, you usually have to charge a lower price. So that's where the discount effect comes in. So the discount effect is simply equal to the discount that you have to give to buyers to sell one more laptop multiplied by the quantity of unit that you sell at that new price. So it's going to be represented by the change in price and then the quantity that is sold at that price. So these two effects are going to determine what our marginal revenue curve looks like. So what we have said here is our output effect is simply the price of the extra item you sell. And then the discount effect is simply the price cut that you give to your consumers multiplied by the quantity that you get from selling at that price cut. So the output effect minus the discount effect is going to be reflected with our marginal revenue curve. Now we are going to build on this idea in our second point here, which is the marginal revenue curve. It lies below the demand curve and it declines faster. So why is this the case? Now, the marginal revenue curve, it lies below the demand curve because if you sell one more item, you need to cut your price so that the marginal revenue is the price you get for that extra item minus the discount effect. So we see that the marginal revenue curve represents two things: the price that you get, which is the output effect, minus the discount effect, which is the change in price, times the quantity. So if we expand this, we have price minus the change in price multiplied by the quantity. So the marginal revenue is always going to be lower than the price because of this discount effect. So we see from this table that when the price is 2,400, marginal revenue is 2,400. And then when the price reduced to 2,300, marginal revenue also reduced, but then much lower. And then when the price was 2,200, marginal revenue was 2,000. And then when the price was 2,100, marginal revenue is 1,800. We are simply saying that whenever you draw your demand and marginal revenue curve, the firm's demand curve simply reflects the prices, the various prices that the firm charges. And this marginal revenue curve is going to lie below the demand curve because at every price that the firm charges, the marginal revenue curve embodies something extra, which is the discount effect. So this discount effect pushes the marginal revenue down below the price of the good, which makes it lie below the demand curve, and it declines faster. So it declines faster than the firm's demand curve because the discount effect gets larger as you sell more output. Price cut for many customers will cut into your revenue more than a price cut for a few customers would. So we're also going to build on this to look at our third point here, which is marginal revenue curve is downward sloping in imperfect competition. So we know that in imperfect competition, firms have some degree of market power. So what we mean by imperfect competition here is, an example is oligopoly or monopolistic competition. So in this case, there are few competitors and also firms sell somewhat differentiated products. And we've seen in the first part of this lesson that in imperfect competition, firms have some degree of market power. Raising their prices will lead to a loss of customers, but not all of them. So this results in a negative slope of the marginal revenue curve. So they will lose some customers if they sell at higher prices, but they're not going to lose all of them like in perfect competition. Because in imperfect competition, they are competitors, but they are quite few. Firms can still retain a good number of their customers even when they charge higher prices. So this is going to lead to a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. So this is all that we have on the second part of our lesson on setting prices when you have market power. Our next lesson is going to be on the third part of the same topic. If you enjoyed today's lesson, consider subscribing. Thank you.